Welcome and thank you for joining Cohesity Catalyst 2023. On average, enterprises rely on 130 SaaS applications to operate their business. And that accounts for roughly 50% of all your data sitting in the cloud. Yet, only a third of the organizations, or should I say, a third of the organizations are not protecting that SaaS data with an enterprise class backup and recovery solution. I'm Raj Tat from Cohesity Cloud Services, and in this session, we will be discussing with our expert panel on reasons why you should protect your SaaS application data. So without any further ado, let me introduce our expert panel. Shannon Keen, our expert guest speaker. Shannon, welcome to the chat.
Thank you for having me.
Shannon, before we go to Teresa, could you maybe just share a few things about yourself?
Sure. My name is Shannon Keen. I'm a principal solution architect at Ahead, and I work in the cloud and DevOps group inside of managed services. So I'm working with customers all of the time, trying to get them to realize the value of cloud. And that's across the actual cloud hyperscalers, as well as some of these SaaS applications as well.
Great to have you, Shannon, and our very own our in-house expert, Teresa Miller. Welcome, Teresa.
Thanks for having me.
Teresa, if you could just share a couple of things about yourself with the audience.
Absolutely. So, I am the director of technical advocacy at Cohesity. I've been working at Cohesity for about 4.5 years, but I've been an IT practitioner for over 25 years. And my background with SaaS goes back to its beginning, deploying and architecting for various organizations and customers.
Great, Teresa. Again, looking forward to working with you on this. So, like I said, 130 different applications are what businesses rely on to operate. Just curious, and maybe Shannon, starting with you, have you, how many applications do you use, SaaS applications do you use on a daily basis for both your personal and work life?
Yeah, I think that's the hard part, right? That designation between personal and enterprise or personal and business. I'd say somewhere in between 10 to 20 if I had to guess. I'm trying to think of this fast. I'm thinking somewhere in that range, and it spans across, kind of your typical M365 space, as well as apps like Dropbox, Google Drive, those types of apps that I use pretty regularly to share files with different folks.
Yeah, and Teresa, how about you? I know you and I use quite a few same apps, but do you stop and think about how many SaaS applications do you use on a daily basis?
I don't think we stop to think about it, but when you ask the question, I take pause and I start thinking about what I'm using, not only from a work perspective, but also what I have at my fingertips on my phone that might even be personal. And because a lot of those applications are also SaaS, we don't think about where the data lives, but is
Right.
definitely not on my device. So if I had to take a guess, I would probably go with closer to 20 on any given day.
Yeah, that's what I was when I was looking at just out of curiosity of how many apps I use, and it's right in that neighborhood. So we obviously, like I said, a lot of applications used by businesses, and these applications are generating a lot of data. In fact, a recent study we found that almost half of the data is sitting in these or generated by these applications. So Shannon, starting with you, given there is so much of reliance and so much of data that is out there, should organizations think about protecting this data? Is it required to protect SaaS data?
So I would think yes, right? Just because of the fact that in every single cloud operating model, the burden of responsibility for identities and data will always fall on the customer, right? And it's just a matter of understanding what requirements you have to meet on a daily basis, on a monthly basis, on a yearly basis, versus having your auditors unfortunately come and maybe you're not ready to showcase your backup strategy, what that looks like in an end-to-end fashion. So I do think it's important to ensure that your SaaS applications are backed up.
Yeah, great point. It's all about who's actually responsible for the data. So coming to you, Teresa, I know you and I have had this discussion in different formats, but what's your thought on the need to protect SaaS data?
Yeah, so to expand on what Shannon shared, she said The data responsibility almost always falls on the customer. The other side of that, though, is what does the SaaS provider do for you? Because I completely agree with her. If it's your enterprise data, you're going to need to protect it, because what the SaaS provider does is offers high availability. They're going to make sure your backend infrastructure and servers are online, and they're going to make sure that the application that you're using is available. So in the end, it's a shared responsibility mindset that we need to have. And we should never assume that our SaaS provider is going to do any level of recovery for us. In fact, I think we'll dive into that a little bit more, but I just want to highlight a lot of the agreements don't even have an SLA in them.
Yeah, in fact, I do want to go back, Sharon, something that you said early on. You talked about M365. I think when we look at business productivity, that is probably by far the most used application. I think last I saw it was
I would
350
think so.
million
Right.
users on a monthly active users, paid users on a monthly basis. So with that in mind, if I'm using it, can I use or should organizations rely on the native capabilities? Because most of the SaaS application providers, they do provide some level of protection. I don't know if I want to call it backup. In fact, that's another question we should probably look at.
Right.
Um, should organizations rely on the native capabilities provided by SaaS applications to protect their data?
So,
And
oh, sorry.
actually, you know what? I'm going to take this back. I think I jumped the question. Um, great points, Teresa and Shannon. But what are we trying to protect the data against? Are SaaS data or the data generated by SaaS application vulnerable to similar challenges that are on-prem? So what are the challenges that we're trying to hedge against when we're trying to protect this data? Any thoughts on that?
So I would think of it like this, right? It's always going to be tough if your end users may not have enough education to understand what a potential phishing attack is, right? And given the fact that a lot of companies are using M365 or some sort of hosted email solution, I think of that as a pretty heavy target, right? And social engineering attacks have gotten more and more interesting, more and more sophisticated. And I think it's one of those things to ensure that you've got a way of backing up your SaaS applications, just because you never quite know what your end users are going to do. I think I made the joke when we were preparing for this that that's why we have jobs, right? So it's a good thing, but it also gives us extra challenges that we may not necessarily think about on a regular basis. So I think it's one of those things just to be conscious of, and then matching that maybe to a regulatory compliance idea as well, right? So taking a look at what you need and how many months worth of data, how many days worth of data, how many, that type of thing is probably understanding it a little bit more on a regular basis.
Makes sense. So more on compliance side. Teresa, how about you? What are your thoughts in terms of what are we trying to protect against when we're looking at protecting SaaS application data?
Yeah. So one, I want to go back to what Shannon said. I couldn't agree more on the phishing and social engineering being a challenge for organizations. Um, Back when I started trying to block some of these attacks as an exchange administrator years ago, it was tricky then, and it's even harder now. So I do think there have to be ways to continually educate your users, and different types of tools need to be deployed to support that. But beyond that, I also think that there are some simple things that we should even be thinking about, right? Users accidentally delete stuff all the time. So I mean, I've done it, and I've had plenty of support calls around that. And it's also, it can be a single item, or it could be something mass scale. It's just we're human, right? Things happen.
Hmm.
And so that is also, I think, an interesting consideration here.
Yeah. So basically, what you're saying is human error. I've heard bad configurations or misconfigurations. Obviously, cyber has been top of mind for most business decision makers. And then, Shannon, you were talking about the compliance. So these are serious issues or serious reasons why one should consider protecting the SaaS application data. And Shannon, you were talking about Microsoft 365.
Mhm.
I think last I checked, that is probably the most used uh, business productivity SaaS application out there, with
Right.
almost 350 plus million users on a monthly basis, paid users. Um, but the most SaaS applications out there, including Microsoft 365, it offers some level of protection. It has some native capabilities. I don't know if I would call it backup, and we can maybe talk about that in a minute or two. Um, but can businesses rely, or should businesses rely on the native capabilities provided by SaaS applications, for example, Microsoft 365? So Sharon, maybe start with you.
Sure, sure. So I think it's okay to rely on it, right? I don't think it's probably what you're going to rely on long term. I think of your backup strategy as, what was it, 3-2-1, three different versions of it, two different copies live on prem, one lives off site. I think a similar approach could apply here. Now everything's software defined, so we relinquish a lot of control to the cloud provider. So you could have an extra backup or lean on the native solution in conjunction with your full-blown enterprise backup solution, right? So I don't think it's a bad thing to lean on it, but it's probably not going to be the only thing you want to lean on. Another thing too, and I know we had talked about this a little bit when we were prepping for today, the idea that customers sometimes think of like resiliency or high availability as like a backup, and that's not the case, right? And so it's another thing just to be conscious of as customers are embracing more SaaS applications for their enterprise data.
So resilience, you can get some level of resilience from the application providers. Let's not confuse that with backup.
Right, right. And I think that's a pretty common thing. I worked with customers who were both realizing the value of M365 and realizing the value of Azure simultaneously. And so I often feel like sometimes customers have a lot of maybe distracting thoughts, right? And so they get their idea that we have a backup strategy for Azure, everything should be fine for M365. And that's when you want to probably look a little bit more in depth at what the native capabilities are and match it up to what you're looking for in terms of your company.
Yeah, no, and the reason I'm smiling is because just yesterday, Teresa and I were working on something, and me, after working with Cohesity for a long time now, for 6 years, I was calling native backup, or I'm still calling it native protection, as backup. And Teresa, she's like, it's actually not backup, Raj. It's called retention. So Teresa, so it's a very common. You raise a very good point, Shannon. It's a very common misconception and mislabeling of what the native capabilities are providing.
Right.
So obviously, Teresa, if you want to chime in here based on what we were discussing yesterday, just love to get your thoughts on it.
Absolutely. So if we were to just peel back the layers on M365 native protection, everything in there is not backup. It's all retention and policy based. So what that means is that the administrator needs to go in and make some decisions around how long they may want to keep things. And then on top of that, Microsoft is going to have some thresholds. So for example, if we just talk about mailboxes, deleted item retention out of boxes 15 days, the administrator could take that to 30. And when you consider what was possible with an on-prem deployment, you could have taken that to pretty much any level you wanted. So in any case, native options are good to have, but there are definitely a lot of scenarios where they won't be suitable for any kind of mass scale recovery. And that goes back to my point before, where there just aren't any recovery SLAs that are documented in contracts, because you're not really capturing a point in time with these. Users can go in and delete stuff, and then it falls off because maybe it's only, the policy only retains it for 30 days or 93 days, and then it's gone.
So if I'm hearing you right, um, if you as a user or an IT operator decision maker, you're okay with the short defined retention period and the risk that it comes with it, then native capabilities are okay. But for things like compliance that Sharon was previously talking about, if you need to retain your emails, which we all know, I mean, we are hoarders of emails. Most of us are. I know I am. We need to have a backup enterprise solution that will let organizations retain that data for a longer period of time.
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to both have a backup solution and use the native options. The native options are good for one-off scenarios, and a full-on backup solution is necessary for any kind of large-scale recovery. Actually, let me give you an example. There will be another session here that I'm delivering with one of our customers. I'll drop a little spoiler on that session, in that he shares a situation where they were leveraging the native options for all of M365, but they were backing up with Cohesity. And they initiated their migration from on-prem to cloud of that data. And there was some corruption. They actually lost data during the migration process. If they had not been leveraging a third-party solution, such as ours, to be protecting that M365 data before the migration, they would not have gotten that data back.
Yeah, I know, great point. In fact, when I was doing some research for our session, um, didn't realize that actually once the user stops paying, or for whatever reason the account gets closed, you actually end up losing all of your data. Microsoft, we talked about M365, so just keep using that as an example. They will delete your data. The data will not be retained for any day. Right? That's a big risk, because we know for
Right.
sure contracts do get expired accidentally, and things can get lost in the process.
Right.
Um,
You don't get to keep that recovery point that you probably would like for a longer period of time.
Great. So yeah, great points about, definitely look at the native capabilities that your SaaS provider is offering, but also look at a third-party application or third-party solution to protect your data. So um, when we do look at addressing this challenge of recovery, Teresa, that you were talking about, what should organizations be looking at? What should be the selection criteria as they're looking at an enterprise class third party solution for their data protection, SaaS data protection?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think for me, I would break that into um, probably three different buckets. So one, the most simplest is because we have an as a service offering, for example. Perhaps it's budget focused. So let's just talk about budget. You may not want to be managing depreciation of CapEx. You may want to actually get yourself out of the infrastructure business. So that for me is more of a business level reason than a technical level, but I do think it's interesting. I think the second piece to this answer for me revolves around what the business is actually trying to accomplish. Meaning, do you think, so we talked about SLAs. What about long-term retention? What about migrations or mergers and acquisitions, for example? I think there are a bunch of different business use cases where you would need this. And then the third piece of my answer revolves around cyber risk and attacks, and being able to have some level of immutability that you would never get out of the native options in your SaaS solution.
Got it. Yeah, this definitely goes back to the challenges that we're talking about as to why one should even look at investing. So Sharon, coming to you, same question. What are your think of checklists that you should consider
Sure.
in your enterprise class protection?
Sure. I think of it sort of similarly, right? I think you want to make sure you understand what the business priorities are. You want to make sure that if you're a financial institution, that you're backing up your data, because there's no bad day like a bad day when your backups fail. So you want to make sure, if you are in those types of heavily regulated environments, that you've got a good backup strategy. And maybe if you're aligned to any sort of compliance framework, NIST, right? If
Mhm.
you are SEC regulated, those types of things tend to come to mind just based upon my own previous life, right? Working with customers, especially the financial service customers, this is where things would get sticky pretty quickly. Talking to them exactly on how often they would want that backup to happen, right? Did they want an end of month snapshot? Did they want an end of a 3-month snapshot, right? So, really kind of getting into the nitty gritty details with customers is probably that kind of discovery side of things. And then I think there's opportunity here as well for developers or for folks that are building dev or test environments to also have their backups think thought through, just because of the fact that if you've got a development team and maybe they're using data that's not real data, right? It's fake data, but it's to run and simulate load or something of that sort. You may want to be able to back that up somewhat regularly, right? It would fall outside of the regulatory requirements, but it might be one of those things that would be an interesting thing to talk about. So I do think of this like having conversations with key folks across the business, just because of the fact that it's the only way you're really going to understand what's happening. And it's the only way I think that you'll get a better picture on what the strategy would look like. So maybe it's just a fact of kind of tiering through the applications. You've got your mission critical applications. You've got maybe your middle kind of the, like middle of the road type of applications. And maybe you've got your applications that might need to have that regulatory requirement applied to it. So similar to Teresa, not quite the same, but definitely similar to Teresa. So we're kind of on the same page there.
Yeah, no, you both definitely touched on a few similar topics. But if I was to just list it out, I think you're talking about what are your business requirements. Look at that, whether it's in terms of your operational capabilities, as Teresa was talking about. Do you not want to have something on prem, have everything in the cloud? And Shannon, you were talking about more in terms of looking at your SLAs, looking at what exactly are you looking at in terms of when do you need to recover it? When do you need to back up? How often do you need to back up? I also heard you guys talk about the cyber resilience part, so immutability. Is the data that you're protecting with an application with a third party solution, is it immutable? And the other thing that I do actually hear from our customers when I talk to them is also around isolation. You don't want to have everything in one place, i.e., your production data and your backup copy. Shannon, in fact, you mentioned that you said the 3-2-1 rule.
Right.
So keeping that in mind also is something top of mind for businesses. These are really good points, Shannon and Teresa. In fact, Teresa, if I stay with you and I just double click on something you said, um, you talked about cyber resilience, and that's one of the reasons why organizations should look at leveraging a third party to protect their SaaS application data. But then, if I'm looking at cyber insurance, that's a hot topic today as well. Can I or would organizations qualify um, for their cyber insurance or with a cyber insurance carrier if they're relying on native protection capabilities from the SaaS vendor?
It's a really great question, Raj. It's interesting because there used to not be requirements for cyber insurance that it made an organization do things such as back up all of their data. And SaaS is definitely part of that. If you've deployed SaaS, it's very likely your potential cyber insurance carrier or the one that you're using today would absolutely require that. Um, because they don't want to insure somebody or an organization that's not taking the right measures to protect themselves. I mean, like any insurance, the goal is to not have to pay. So I think they've just gotten really strict on what technical requirements and hardening techniques you need in your organization to even be accepted in their plans now.
Yeah, no, very true. We keep on reading how hard it is to get cyber insurance nowadays. So, Shannon, any thoughts from your side to add to what Teresa said?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the idea of you've got to match it to something, right? And now that more of these technical requirements are being made known, it's a matter of taking a look at what the native capabilities provide and figuring out that little gap analysis. Where am I missing the requirements to meet what we need, right? And that's where it would, take a look at probably your third party solutions, just because of the fact
Mhm.
that even with M365, Microsoft always recommends, if you need it, having some sort of third party tool to back up your SaaS estate. So it's more of that gap analysis, mapping business needs, mapping requirements. But I think of it kind of as a very similar topic or a very similar area to explore if that's an area that you need to kind of strengthen or bolster.
Makes sense. So, for cyber insurance, especially with the current environment, again, it goes back to what your business requirements are. If you are looking for a cyber insurance, you might want to consider investing in a third-party solution. I know we spend a lot of time talking about M365, given how important it is for businesses. But like we said in the beginning, it's not the only business productivity application, a SaaS application that we rely on. I mean, think of Salesforce. There are a lot of other financial applications like Workday or HR related. Um, are those all similar? Can we put all of them in one bucket like we would in the traditional with the traditional applications when it comes to backup data protection? Shannon, let me start with you there.
Yeah, I would think you'd have to look at each one of the vendors specifically and figure out what they're using on the native front and figure out, does it align 100% to what you're looking for related to backup and protection, right? Because each one of them's ever so slightly different. You are relinquishing the burden of the responsibility. Most of it's falling on the vendor, but you still want to make sure that your identities and your data are protected. And so it's taking a look at the SLA, taking a look at the native functionality and figuring out at what point you need to sort of pull that trigger, right? Or flip that switch and think about a third party backup tool. So I think it's just a matter of getting into the details of what's offered within each one of these solutions, because I don't know enough about what Salesforce offers. I know I use it, but I don't know exactly what is offered, right? And Workday, I would have to take a look at that as well, right? So you want to make sure that whatever you're storing inside of those applications has the right level of protection. I think, of my own background, the auditors always show up at the most inopportune times. And if you don't have a handle on what's being done with your SaaS applications, it's not a great day, right? And I think if anybody's out there, you haven't thought about what SaaS applications are going on in your environment, there's tools you can deploy to see what's being done, right? Because I think, it was a very common thing when cloud came to enable these business units to run fast. They might get a corporate card, they might get
Mm.
abilities to go buy something, and maybe central IT is sort of taken out of the hot seat. There's no request coming in, there's no ticket, there's no change control. It's unfortunate, but it did happen. And so there are tools you can use to sort of figure out what's being used, right? And so you can make sure that you are protected and that what is being placed on these SaaS applications or what's being placed in these SaaS applications has the right level of protection.
Yeah, well said. I mean, proliferation of SaaS applications. We all have done that. We all go sign up for things, and IT,
Right.
unfortunately, is kept out of the loop. So, Teresa, coming to you with the same question. Um, are they all the same? Should we look at them differently? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, to Shannon's point, what each solution has is going to be different because there's no industry standard around how a SaaS application develops even their product. So some leverage retention policy, some have um, choices built into the CLI or command line that you can export off to files. Um, if I were to just take this to its simplest state, while we're talking about SaaS today, when I think back to all the on-prem tools I've ever deployed, it was always different there too. And I never assumed that I should not back it up. As soon as a new application was deployed that stored my organization's enterprise data, it was part of the process to back it up. So if you come back to why we're seeing all these differences in SaaS, I think it goes back to the fact that it was never something anyone ever intended for the application owner or creator to offer. So I think we just have to look out for our organizations, our businesses, and protect it. Protect it in as many ways as you can. Use what the SaaS provider is offering, but also protect it with your own tool.
Yeah, no, well said. I think if we were to start wrapping up the session, and let me recap before I come back to you for your closing comments. Um, the applications are all across. They're serving multiple different functions, and a large amount of data is being generated by these applications within our enterprise space. So these applications or the data from these applications absolutely needs to be protected, and based on your business requirements, you need to look at the native capabilities, but also the third party options available to address things like human error, cyber threats, compliance. I mean, business SLAs. I mean, all these are fairly important things to consider as you're looking at getting more and more SaaS applications adopted within an organization. So, Teresa, before we close, let me start with you. Um, Closing comments, key takeaways that you want our audiences that they can go back with, and something they can act upon with their teams from this session.
Yeah, absolutely. So, just a couple points. So, one, understand what you're getting for protection in your SaaS offering. Um, Understand your business SLAs because you likely need more, and really understand that data. And then the last thing that I wanted to call out here is um, shared responsibility. Your enterprise data is yours, and the provider, even though they're managing your infrastructure, that's really where they draw the line, right? It's disasters with that infrastructure and the software install, and it's less about your enterprise data.
Makes sense. Thank you so
Mhm.
much. Shannon, closing comments, key takeaways from you.
Yeah, I think to really hit home on that shared burden of responsibility, I don't know if you've seen I think it's the pizza as a service, right? You talk about your
Hmm.
hosting it on-prem, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and then software as a service. You're always still responsible for your identity and your data. So to really hit home on that, make sure you have a good handle on what you have to back up and why. And then making sure that whatever applications are deployed within your enterprise, that you map it to a business unit, you map it to a key stakeholder, something of that sort, and really get to know the SLA, because that's the hard part, right? Microsoft does it different than Salesforce, than Google, than even Dropbox. I've seen Dropbox and Box used in the enterprise, right? And it's always a mystery as to why it was deployed or installed. And it's just the idea that we're moving so fast. It's an opportunity to pause and reflect and map these SaaS applications to the business need, making sure that the SLAs match up, right? And if they don't match up based upon a backup, right, the native tooling, that's when you know to bring in a third party solution that'll back up everything for you and give you that peace of mind. One other thing is just to make sure your end users are educated, right? Phishing attacks have gotten way more sophisticated to the point that you might get an email from Chase and it might 100%, well, maybe not 100%, but close to 100% look like a legit email. And there are key identifiers to take a look at for each message that might be coming to your work account that might be a phishing exercise trying to get access to corporate data. I've worked at companies that send out some sort of test email periodically, and they want to make sure that users are paying attention, right? And then they'll also build out training for the organization as a whole, just to make sure that they're paying attention to the emails versus clicking on links randomly and potentially opening up the floodgate to malicious attacks. So I think those are probably the two things I would stress are really important. Knowing the SLAs, mapping it to the business units as a result or the business function, and then making sure that your users are educated so that they know how to respond if there's ever a phishing attack.
So what you're saying is, next time when I get an email from Teresa, I can always say it's a phishing attack and not respond back to me.
And not respond. And then I'll be like, Raj.
Raj, it really was me.
It really was me.
Great point, Shannon. Education, obviously, let's not forget about that. People are one of the weakest links. We tend to mess things up. But yeah, great points. Again, I want to thank you, Shannon, so much for your time.
Sure.
A lot of good discussion. Teresa, as always, great to have you.
Yep, glad to be
with
here.
that, I do want to thank our viewers. Hope you enjoy Catalyst 2023, and stay tuned for more programming. Thank you.